There are moments in history when the old world begins to crack and something new begins to shoulder its way through. New ideals, new sensibilities, new priorities. The ground shifts beneath people's feet, and they know instinctively that nothing will ever be quite the same again. Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, is one of the most extraordinary attempts ever made to give sound to a moment like that. To capture in music the sensation of history itself changing gear. I find myself drawn to a particular image when I think about this symphony. Imagine trying to photograph something moving almost too fast for the camera to catch. The result is blurred, not quite in focus, and yet somehow that blur is the truth of it. It captures the movement, the energy of what's happening. That, I think, is what Beethoven achieved. The Eroica is not a perfect, composed picture of a new world. It is the sound of a world in the very act of becoming. So what I want to do is follow that story. How did this symphony come into being? What was the world that produced it? What exactly was Beethoven reaching for? And why is it that more than 2 centuries later, it still feels like one of the most astonishing pieces of music ever composed? But before we begin, let me take a moment to welcome you. If you've been here before, I'm very glad you've come back. And if this is your first time with Orpheus Lyre, welcome. I hope you find something here worth staying for. If these stories mean something to you, you can help them find their way to others by leaving a comment, liking the video, sharing it with someone who might enjoy it, or subscribing to the channel. And now, back to Beethoven. Anyone even faintly acquainted with Beethoven's Third Symphony will know the celebrated story. Ludwig van Beethoven had dedicated the symphony to Napoleon Bonaparte. And then, on hearing that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, he flew into a rage and tore the title page apart. The story is true. And yet it is not the whole story. Other contemporary accounts add further clues, and those clues matter because they point us towards particular events that may have fired Beethoven's imagination. His doctor, Andrea Bertolini, traced the work's conception all the way back to the Egyptian campaign of 1798, that extraordinary moment when Napoleon's ambitions seemed to reach beyond Europe, into a world of pyramids and pharaohs, of myth and ancient memory. Others, listening to the funeral march, heard echoes of contemporary loss, the false report of Horatio Nelson's death that circulated after the Battle of Aboukir Bay in June 1798, or, as Carl Czerny would later suggest, the fall of General Ralph Abercrombie, the British commander killed in Egypt in the very struggle against Napoleon's army. There is another story here, likely not true, but revealing nonetheless, that Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte urged Beethoven to compose a tribute to Napoleon. Bernadotte was one of the leading generals of revolutionary France, and in 1798 he served briefly as French ambassador in Vienna. It is, on the face of it, a remarkable image. The great general, who would one day become King of Sweden, and the great composer, together in a room, talking about music and politics and the future of the world. Scholars today doubt it ever happened. But that hardly matters because the story points us in the right direction. And the direction it points is France. Because if we are really to understand the origins of the Eroica, it is towards France and towards the revolution that we must look. The revolution had overthrown the monarchy and tried to reshape French society through idealism and terror. And the ideas it unleashed didn't stay in France. They crossed borders, crossed rivers, crossed the Alps, and they arrived in Vienna. Even there, that city of ceremony and dynastic splendor, of powdered wigs and elaborate courtesies, where the old order seemed to have been carved from stone, even there something had shifted. The old certainties, monarchy, hierarchy, tradition, no longer felt quite so certain. To many, that was a cause for dread. The spectre of chaos, the collapse of everything inherited and familiar. To others, though, to the young, the ambitious, the restless, it hinted at something different, new possibilities. a future no longer bounded by the accident of birth. Beethoven was among those who felt that pull most intensely. And in Napoleon Bonaparte, at least for a time, he saw something extraordinary. Those ideals of liberty and equality, that challenge to inherited privilege made flesh. Here was no emperor, no founder of dynasties. Here was a general of a republic, a man who had risen not by the accident of birth, but by talent, and by a sheer, almost ferocious force of will. That fascination with France may even have led Beethoven to contemplate a journey to Paris. Ferdinand Ries, his pupil and close associate, later recalled that such a journey had indeed been in his mind. The dedication of the Kreutzer Sonata, addressed ultimately to the French violinist Rodolphe Kreutzer, points in much the same direction. In the end, he never made the journey. But in many respects, the Eroica became a replacement for it. And now we come to one of the most dramatic scenes in the entire history of music. I want to quote directly from Ferdinand Ries, because his account captures the moment with a vividness that no paraphrase could improve on. With regard to this symphony, Beethoven had thought of Napoleon, but only so long as he was still first consul. Beethoven had the highest regard for him and compared him with the greatest Roman consuls. I myself, as well as several of his closest friends, saw this symphony lying on his table already written out in score, with the word Bonaparte written at the top of the title page, and Luigi van Beethoven at the bottom, and nothing else. I do not know whether the space in between was to have been filled in, or with what. I was the first to bring him the news that Bonaparte had proclaimed himself emperor, whereupon he flew into a rage and exclaimed, "So he too is nothing more than an ordinary man. Now he too will trample on all the rights of man and indulge only his ambition. He will place himself above everybody else and become a tyrant." He went to the table, seized the title page, tore it in half, and threw it to the floor. It is an extraordinary scene, and I don't think we should doubt that the fury was real. Beethoven's rage leaps off the page across 2 centuries. And yet, and this is where history has a habit of complicating the stories we'd like to tell cleanly, the evidence, on closer inspection, is more ambiguous than that theatrical gesture might suggest. Other manuscript sources survive in which Napoleon's name is only partially erased. Scratched out, yes, but not entirely. And then there is Beethoven himself, writing to his publisher just a few months after that famous scene, quietly admitting, and these are his own words, "The symphony, to tell the truth, is entitled Bonaparte." The indignation, it seems, was genuine, but it had not quite burned away everything. The connection between the man and the music, that vision of Napoleon as a hero of a new age, proved harder to sever than a torn title page might suggest. In the end, it was not Beethoven's conscience, but the march of events that settled the matter. As France and Austria lurched towards war, a public dedication to Napoleon had become not merely awkward, but impossible. And so, when the symphony was finally published in 1806, it appeared under an entirely new identity, Sinfonia Eroica, composed to celebrate the memory of a great man, and dedicated to Prince Lobkowitz. Napoleon's name had vanished, but his ghost, I would argue, never entirely left the music. But there is something else we need to hold in view, because Napoleon and the fever of the French Revolution are only part of the story. To understand what Beethoven was reaching for in the Eroica, we have to reckon with what was happening inside the man himself. In the autumn of 1802, Beethoven appears to have been struck by an illness so serious that rumours of his death had begun to spread. We catch a fleeting glimpse of this in a letter from Joseph Wölfl, an Austrian pianist and composer who moved in the same Viennese circles as Beethoven. And what makes that moment so poignant is that it falls at precisely the same time as the writing of the Heiligenstadt Testament. If you haven't read that document, I would urge you to seek it out, because it is one of the most raw and devastating things any great artist has ever committed to paper. In it, Beethoven confronts his deafness, his isolation, his despair, with a candor that is almost impossible to read without feeling the weight of it pressing down on you. And yet, he did not break. What followed was not merely a physical recovery. It was something far more remarkable. A recovery of creative will, of artistic ferocity. Out of that darkness, something new and almost violent was born in Beethoven's art. A force that had not been there before, or not in quite that form. And it was that force which would find its first, overwhelming expression in the Eroica. The symphony began to take shape in sketches from 1802. Through 1803, it consumed him, and by 1804, it was complete. Early private performances gave him the chance to hear how the work breathed, how it held together under the pressure of its own extraordinary ambition, and how audiences responded to a scale and scope unlike anything they had encountered before. The public premiere came in 1805, and the symphony was published the following year. And there is one small detail about that publication which I find genuinely illuminating, and which I think it's worth pausing over. In a letter reported by Caspar Karl, Beethoven advised his publisher to issue, alongside the usual piano reductions and chamber arrangements, a pocket score, and here I'm quoting Beethoven's own words, so that every connoisseur may be in a position to acquire it. That is a remarkable thing to say, and I don't think we should let it pass without reflection. It tells us that Beethoven understood the Eroica not only as an experience to be heard in a concert hall, but as something to be studied, wrestled with, returned to on the page. He was not simply writing music to be performed and forgotten. He was writing something he believed could bear that kind of sustained, intimate scrutiny, something that lived as fully in silence, in the reading, as it did in sound. And so let's turn to the music itself, to what Beethoven actually did. Let's begin with the first movement, and with something that would have struck any listener in 1805, almost before a single theme had registered: the sheer, almost intimidating size of it. By the standards of anything Haydn or Mozart had written, this movement is vast. The development section, that part of a classical symphony where the composer takes his themes apart and tests them under pressure, here expands to a scale that had simply never been attempted before. And then comes the coda, which in most symphonies of the period would round things off neatly and send the audience home satisfied. Not here. In the Eroica, the coda feels less like a conclusion than like a whole new development breaking out, as if the music refuses to be contained, refuses to end on anyone else's terms. Classical form is being pushed, in the first movement alone, almost to its breaking point. And then there are the two opening chords. They hit you before you're ready. They're abrupt, stark, almost confrontational. When you look at the surviving sketches, you can see that Beethoven had initially explored something more conventional, a proper introduction, easing the listener in, preparing the ground, as any well-mannered 18th century symphony would have done. He tried various possibilities, and then abandoned all of them. What survives of that whole process is just those two chords. No preparation, no easing in. The drama is already underway before you've had a chance to settle. And yet, there is something else worth noting about them. They are not simply a dramatic opening gesture that the music then leaves behind. They return later, transformed but still very recognizable. And that points to something larger about how Beethoven's mind works. His ability to take the smallest fragment of material and find in it possibilities that other composers would simply never have thought to look for. You can hear that same instinct at work in the way he handles his themes. Where an older composer would present broad, clearly shaped melodies, themes you could hum, themes with a beginning and an end, Beethoven breaks his material down into far smaller units, little cells, fragments, and then he sets them in motion, evolving, colliding, reappearing in entirely new guises, transformed almost beyond recognition, and then suddenly snap back into focus. The inventiveness and technical command are astonishing. And for audiences, hearing this for the first time, it was frankly bewildering. And then the second movement arrives, and everything changes. It is a funeral march, which immediately raises a question that Beethoven, characteristically, refuses to answer for us. Who is being mourned? We don't know. We cannot know. Is Beethoven imagining the death of his hero, Napoleon, still very much alive at the time of writing, and yet somehow in Beethoven's mind already marked for a fall? Or is he reaching for something far more universal? The thought that mortality is the ground beneath all human greatness? That every act of heroism is performed in the end, in the face of oblivion? He doesn't tell us. And I think that silence is deliberate. What is clear is that with this movement, Beethoven steps into territory that the classical symphony had never before entered. Haydn and Mozart's slow movements could achieve profound beauty and a deep kind of feeling entirely their own, but they feel very far away here. The funeral march inhabits an entirely different register. It has a weight, a gravity that can make it feel almost like a separate world that the symphony has suddenly opened into, a vast, still space of mourning and reflection. And yet, even within that space, Beethoven cannot keep the music quiet for long. The march is repeatedly unsettled. A fugato emerges, intricate, almost severe. And then, without warning, the music surges into sudden violent climaxes that seem to tear at the very fabric of the procession, disrupting its solemn tread with something that feels like anguish. I like to think of it this way. The man being mourned has fallen, and yet the heroic spirit that once animated him refuses to die with him, breaking through the grief, insisting against all odds on its own survival. After the weight of the funeral march, the third movement arrives like a sudden intake of breath. It is marked Scherzo, quick, light, crackling with nervous energy. And what strikes you almost immediately is what it is not. In earlier symphonies, this was the place for a minuet, courtly, balanced, graceful, a moment of elegant relief between weightier things. That world is gone. Beethoven has swept it away entirely. What replaces it is something far more volatile, music of speed and motion and sudden flickering life. The outer sections are hushed and swift, almost weightless, the orchestra moving in quick, darting gestures that seem to vanish almost before you can catch them. And then the central trio opens out, the horns stepping forward with a new boldness and solidity, lending the movement a briefly heroic cast, before the scherzo comes rushing back, restless and airborne as before. The outline, taken on its own, is simple enough, but the spirit is entirely new. Beethoven has taken a form that once belonged to the ballroom and transformed it into something that could never have existed there, something alive, ungovernable, and thrillingly difficult to pin down. And so we arrive at the final movement. After everything that has come before, the vast, almost crushing struggle of the first movement, the depth and grief of the funeral march, the restless volatility of the scherzo, you might reasonably expect a grand, triumphant conclusion, a release, a resolution. Instead, Beethoven does something far more unexpected. The finale begins almost disarmingly, with fragments, sketches of ideas, rather than anything that announces itself as a fully formed theme. And yet this material was not new. Beethoven had been living with it for years, most notably in his ballet, The Creatures of Prometheus. That connection is worth pausing over. Prometheus, the figure who steals fire from the gods and brings it to humanity. It stands for creation, defiance, and suffering. He is a bringer of transformation, and the price he pays is enormous. And in Beethoven's mind, at least for a time, Napoleon had carried something of that same charge, a man who seemed to reshape the world through sheer force of will, who appeared to embody the possibility that history itself could be remade. What Beethoven does with this movement is take a single, quiet, almost unassuming theme and put it through a kind of ordeal. The theme appears early, gentle and understated, and then the variations begin. And what follows is less a set of elegant decorations than a journey with all the unpredictability and danger that implies. The music moves through light and shadow, through playfulness and fury, through a stormy outburst that feels almost wild, and then into two fugues that, between them, seem to drag the theme into entirely new territory. The first dark and urgent, the second bright and driven. And just when you think you know where it's heading, the tempo suddenly drops. The ninth variation arrives like a moment of stillness after a long struggle, serene, contemplative, almost wistful, as though the music has stepped back to take stock of everything it has been through. And then comes the 10th. And here, finally, you feel the full weight of what Beethoven has been building towards. The theme returns, but transformed, triumphant now, blazing out across the brass, the whole orchestra surging behind it. The journey, it turns out, was always heading here. And before the symphony closes, Beethoven permits himself one last surprise. The music drops suddenly to almost nothing, and then the orchestra crashes back in with a ferocity that never fails to make you jump, hurling the symphony to its close in a blaze of 3 great chords. In the years that followed its premiere, the Eroica was met with a reaction that tells us almost as much about the moment as about the music itself, a mixture of genuine admiration and genuine bewilderment. Early listeners sensed, quite rightly, that something fundamental had shifted. They just weren't entirely sure what. Before the Eroica, the symphony had largely been governed by balance, proportion, and clarity, the great ideals of the classical age. With the Eroica, those qualities are not simply abandoned, but they are, in the most profound sense, transformed. The symphony becomes something it had never quite been before, a vehicle for expression on a far larger, more turbulent scale. To feel the force of that disorientation, it is worth turning to what contemporaries actually said. In the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung of February 1805, the symphony, still known only from a handful of semi-private performances, was described as a highly elaborate, bold, and wild fantasy that very often seems to lose itself completely in a world without rules. What makes this still more striking is that it came from someone who admired Beethoven. And yet even he could not help confessing that he found in the work an excess of noise and oddity that makes the overall design extremely difficult to grasp and nearly destroys its unity. That gives you a measure of the shock this music caused. Even sympathetic listeners were struggling to find their footing. It was precisely this kind of unease that the German critic and writer Johann Friedrich Rochlitz set out to address in his remarkably substantial review in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung of February 1807. His argument was striking. What some were hearing as eccentricity, contradiction, even chaos, was not a failure of control. It was Beethoven's way of capturing reality. Reality in all its complexity, its tension, its refusal to resolve neatly. Rochlitz was not a romantic in any strict sense of the term, and yet in the way he responded to the Third Symphony, he came very close to what we would recognize as a romantic sensibility. He valued the work precisely because it does not move in a single orderly direction, because it brings together grandeur and strangeness, conflict and contradiction, the sublime and the unsettling all at once. And here, I think, is the heart of it. These are not random detours. They are not signs of a composer losing his way. They are Beethoven's way of reflecting a world that had itself become unstable, too vast, too fractured, too full of unresolved tension to be contained within the older ideals of balance and reason. The Eroica does not simply push against classical form. It registers, in sound, the tremors of an entire civilization in the process of remaking itself. which is why this symphony is so much more than a masterpiece. It is a threshold. On one side stands the world of Haydn and Mozart, ordered, proportioned, luminous in its own way. On the other, something new is coming into being, a sensibility drawn not to poise and symmetry, but to struggle, upheaval, and the depths of individual feeling, the age we have come to call Romantic. Beethoven did not invent that world alone, but with the Eroica, he announced its arrival more powerfully than anyone else had done, or perhaps anyone could have. The composers who came after him, Berlioz, Mahler, and beyond, would build on what he had opened up here, expanding the symphony into territory that would have been unimaginable before that evening in 1805, when those two stark opening chords first rang out. The Eroica changed what music could be, and in doing so, it changed what music could mean. That, in the end, is what it means to stand at a turning point in history. And Beethoven, with this single extraordinary work, stood at one of the greatest of them all. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you for spending these minutes together. I hope this look into Beethoven's Third Symphony has brought the music a little closer. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be grateful if you left a comment or shared your thoughts. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, more journeys through the lives and works of great composers, consider liking the video, subscribing, and tapping the bell. For now, thank you for listening. Take care, and I hope you'll join me again in the next episode.